Howdy. Today, our U.S. history lesson, long distance COVID lesson, is going to be about music in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, I wouldn't be doing you justice as a history teacher if we didn't take a look at those things also in society that are important to people, like music. And the music during this era is really important. A lot of the stuff you listen to today, of course, is built off of this. What kind of music do you kids listen to? I mean, who influences what you listen to? On the picture over there is my son Billy, his senior picture. Billy went to Burke with me, and every day as we drove in, I'd listen to music. I'd listen to the rock that I liked, and I'd introduce my son to the music from the 60s and 70s and 80s that I grew up with and I liked, and I really exposed him to that. And he liked a lot of the music. There's certain of those bands he still to this day really loves. But then he, in high school, started doing some DJing, and he introduced me to a lot of bands today. I really didn't know a lot of contemporary music, and Billy was able to get me into a lot of bands today. So, taking a look at music, and when you out there, your parents are driving along and they're listening to music, do you sing along or do you shake your head and go, oh no, not that? Okay, in this time period, 1965 to about 1975 ish, really music is divided up into a bunch of different categories, but we're going to try to kind of lump some together. You got folk music, pop music, British pop, which is part of pop, but with the British sound, the British invasion, the surfer sound from California, hard rock, Motown and soul, and country. Folk music is what most people think of the 60s and early 70s about. It's a voice of the era. There's still folk music today, but some of the best folk music was probably then. Usually folk music has a simple sound, a guitar, a banjo, simple instruments, not electric, acoustic, and the story is the message. A lot of times you're going to have harmonies. You're going to have groups singing together. Simon and Garfunkel, the Mamas and the Papas, Peter, Paul, and Mary. And you have all these different vocals fitting in together. Some of them were protest songs, and some of the songs were traditional songs that were adapted to protest. Again, in America, we're starting to not like the Vietnam War by 66, 69. You've got the Tet Offensive and everything. And a lot of protest music does that. But folk music more so gives a voice to a generation. And if you look over there, you have to put that down as maybe the greatest songwriter of all time, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is really the voice of the 60s. And Bob Dylan is one of the greatest songwriters of all time. He was able to put songs that meant something, that you can look into the songs and you can see layers of meaning in there. And a lot of his songs are redone by other people and have been sung around. And if you hear Dylan songs on the radio, you'll know them. I mean, Blowing in the Wind is a deep song for the era. The times they are changing seems to be saying that in the 60s, everything was changing. And of course, his Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. Tremendously powerful songs. Some other important folk singers of the era, Simon and Garfunkel. Their Sound of Silence is a classic. But so many of their other songs, Simon and Garfunkel were so poetic, were so smart. They have a song about a guy who writes graffiti in the subway. And they make it sound like the most beautiful poetry ever. And a lot of their songs and music has a layer to it, a depth to it. Simon and Garfunkel, tremendous group. Uh, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Peter, Paul, and Mary were protest singers in the 60s and, sang at stuff like the March on Washington. But their songs also really give a voice to the era. The Mamas and the Papas, another group, their California Dreaming, very important song. Folk music really, by mid-70s, wouldn't say loses its popularity, but it kind of gets pushed to the background by a lot of other different musics. But to people from the 60s and 70s, again, folk music really, they identify with it because that is the sound of their era. The 60s are the time of the British invasion. When the Beatles come to America in 1964, that opens America up. By 1965, 66, 67, the Beatles are huge. The Beatles, with all of their songs, Love Me Do, all the other Beatles songs come, and the Beatles they become the biggest, one of the most popular bands in the world. There's a great movie out there right now about a guy who lives in a world where the Beatles don't exist, and so he plays Beatles music, and people think he's a genius. It's a great movie. You ought to take a look at it. Okay. Another, and of course, if you look over on the picture over in the corner, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band. By the end of the 60s, you see that they go from the short hair to the really long hair psychedelic Beatles, and their music changes too. Eventually, the Beatles will break up in the 70s, and they will have success individually. John Lennon, Paul McCartney will go on and have big albums. George Harrison, Ringo Starr. I mean, the Beatles. You have to know who the four lads from Liverpool are because they change music. The Rolling Stones is another band that comes from England. If you take a look here on the bottom of the picture, there's there's two pictures of the Rolling Stones then and now. Look at Mick Jagger then and now. The Rolling Stones come along and they're still rocking it way into their 70s because they had a heck of a sound. The Who, one of the biggest power groups of all time. I mean, Roger Daltrey, Pete Townshend, John Entwistle, and Keith Moon. The Who, their song "My Generation" really does sound my generation. Led Zeppelin from England. Oh my God, Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, John Bonham. 1971, Stairway to Heaven. Come on, the Led Zeppelin sound is just beautiful. Pink Floyd, when I went to high school, Pink Floyd was really big. Pink Floyd, Money, Pink Floyd, We Don't Need No Education. I mean, A Brick in the Wall. I mean, there's so many songs of Pink Floyd. The British Invasion starts in the 60s, and it doesn't stop. And even today, there's a lot of influence, a lot of influential musicians that come from England. Pop music during this time, and pop music is a huge category. It's just basically contemporary popular music that people listen to. It's very commercial music. Sometimes it's a one-hit wonder. Sometimes they build careers. During the 1960s, they used a lot of synthesizers. There's a group out there called Strawberry Alarm Clock. And if you listen to Strawberry Alarm Clock, you will get the 60s, that heavy synthesizer sound, that psychedelic sound. But there's also a lot of power groups during this era and into the 70s. Start out, though, one of the biggest 60s pop music groups was the Monkees. If you look at the picture over there, the Monkees it was a TV show for kids, and they put together this cast, and really, I think only one of them that really knew their music instruments at the beginning, I think, was Mike, the guy with the sock cap on the end, but they put out some great music. Songs like I'm a Believer, or if you've watched Shrek, they bring that song back. But the Monkees actually sold a lot of albums in America. My sister really loved the Monkees. I do too. I love the show. I really loved the show as a kid. But the Monkees were one of the number one selling groups in America at the time. There were a lot of people that hammered on them, oh, you don't know your music, but they did learn their instruments, and they were hellacious musicians. For soft pop, the Carpenters, if you look up in the corner there, was a brother and a sister, Karen and Richard Carpenter, and they sang a lot of songs. And she had a beautiful voice, and a lot of their ballads and stuff like that, their love songs, become really popular during the 60s or early 70s. Eventually, very sadly, Karen Carpenter would pass away, but I mean, big. Look at John Denver. John Denver was I'm classifying him as pop, but it's hard to classify John Denver, you know? John Denver during this era, Rocky Mountain High, but he had Sunshine on My Shoulders. So many songs. John Denver kind of almost defies a label, but John Denver was really big, and he had been a songwriter, and then on his own he came out with album after album. Very sadly, John Denver also passed much later. If you look over here, there's the Jackson 5. Look at Michael Jackson in the middle. That sound of the Jackson 5 was really fresh. Okay, they were big. Neil Diamond. If you look at the picture, there's Neil Diamond with the guitar. Neil Diamond, with songs like Crackly Rosie, a lot of other songs were coming to America, the Immigrant Song and all. But what Neil Diamond is known mostly now for is Sweet Caroline. And you go to any baseball game, and there it is. But Neil Diamond was a tremendous artist, really smart. The Eagles, by the 1970s, I think the biggest face in pop music has got to be the Eagles. And I mean, people come in and out of the Eagles. You have different lead singers and stuff. But the Eagles and like their Hotel California album and whatnot, very, very, very influential. There's so many pop groups, musics. It's so hard to pick the bands that could be in there or should be in there. And if you talk to your parents, they're going to say, hey, how about this group? How about that group? The Three Dog Nights and the other groups. There's so many musicians in the 70s, the pop music era. But these are the ones I put down were really pretty important. This is also the time of music getting a little bit harder. Harder rock is going to be out there, and it's going to be a little bit edgier, louder, faster, with a bite to it. I mean, there's a lot of groups. If you look down below, there's a picture of a guy with a frayed or kind of like a jacket with got all these fringes hanging off, pointing up. That's Jimi Hendrix. And at Woodstock, His national anthem is really tremendous. Now, a lot of people listen to it today and they think it's a travesty. But if you listen to music and remember, this is during Vietnam and it's the national anthem, but there's a lot of discord in there, just like there was discord in America, in American society. It wasn't meant to be a perfect rendition of the national anthem. It was a reflection of what was happening in America today, then musically. The Doors, if you look at the picture of the four guys are at, and up right above, the very first guy, or the front guy, that's Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison, the Lizard King, and the Doors. The Doors had a sound. And the Doors, L.A. Woman, Riders of the Storm, their albums were really strong, a lot of edgy music, but it was out there. Very sadly, Jim Morrison would overdose in, I think it was like 71. And the Doors were a huge song. For their generation. You don't hear a lot of them, like L.A. Woman's powerful song, a really loud song. Guy next to me when I was in the Coast Guard, we had an apartment off the ship, and the guy next to me was a Doors fan. He had like 5-foot tall speakers, and he would play L.A. Woman. 2 in the morning. Whoa, that was something. You have groups like Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, and this is really the rise of Aerosmith. And Leonard Skinner is Southern rock. Now, you have, like, from the Texas Sound, ZZ Top, and Leonard Skinner. Leonard Skinner, of course, had the great hit Sweet Home Alabama in 74. And if you listen to Sweet Home Alabama, it's 1974. Like we talked about Watergate this week, you hear the references to Watergate in their song in 1974, okay? Very sadly and tragically, 1977, Leonard Skinner crashes. It continues today with one of the founding members who wasn't on the plane, but Leonard Skinner and that unique sound. Hey, Southern rock, you go down to Alabama, Sweet Home Alabama is still kind of like an anthem. But this is the rise of music that's powerful. And one of the ones I just got to really mention is CCR. You see a picture there. I love CCR. Lead singer John Fogerty has a voice that when you hear that voice, you hear it. When we did the Vietnam protests and you heard a song called Fortunate Son, that was his voice. Being baseball time, anytime you hear put me in coach, I can play center field, that's John Fogerty's voice. CCR was a very strong, powerful group. And you could put them in pop music. I'd like to rather put them in harder rock. Very important sound. Motown. Really the rise of soul. The story of Motown really starts with a guy named Berry Gordy. Okay, Berry Gordy has his Detroit roots. Motown is, Motor City, Detroit, but a lot of it was actually recorded in L.A. But Motown is a smooth sound. You have vocalists with voices that are just like honey, and then you have background singers. It's called the soul sound. Now, I'm from Bennington, Nebraska, and Bennington, Nebraska is not like soul of anything back in the 1970s, okay? But I was in the Coast Guard and went down to Antarctica on an icebreaker. And I was in the stateroom with two guys, and they were big into Motown. I was big into country. Well, my country CDs, cassette players, tapes just kept disappearing until eventually mostly what we had to play was Motown. So I started listening to Motown, and oh, I love Motown. It was there's just something about it, and I've always loved it. But it is, everybody, when you say Motown, you think of the Temptations and My Girl. Possibly one of the greatest songs ever. Just a smooth song. But you don't stop there when you're talking Motown. You've got to talk about Lady Diana Ross and Supremes. What a sound. What a strong sound. And Marvin Gaye. Oh, my God. Marvin Gaye has had some of the greatest hits. Stevie Wonder, little Stevie Wonder's in there. A personal favorite of mine after the Temptations, Smokey Robinson. Met a guy back in college years ago, and he told me if I could use Smokey, it was like a secret weapon. He always said. And if you listen to Smokey Robinson's Cruising, just a smooth sound. There's always, to this day, in my heart, a happiness whenever I listen to Motown. And Motown, that soulful sound, is now a chance for African American artists are given a chance to shine, to dominate, and not only in the production, but in the writing and the producing it. And this is really important. Now, later on in the 70s, the next unit, when we get in the 80s, we're going to talk about how Motown changes. And then also we're going to talk about disco and how everything else changes. But the Motown of the 60s and 70s, that's just good music. A unique American sound was the surfer beach sound, the California beach-inspired. This is the Beach Boys era. And you talk about surfing and everything. And California has this allure. And I mean, we're here in Nebraska, we're not surfing. But just the thought that you could be, that it was out there, that sound, and there's I think, guitar sound to it, and a drum. I mean, there is. The Beach Boys are a group from California, okay? Now, the Beach Boys are going to have a lot of songs, but, some of their later stuff, Endless Summer and all, is not even necessarily beach, Kokomo and stuff. But the Beach Boys, but they inspire a wave of music in America. But you don't just stop at the Beach Boys. Jan and Dean were a very powerful group, okay? They had an accident, and it would affect the group, but the music. And the Surfaris. You have to look up Wipeout. Get on YouTube, find the Surfaris and Wipeout, and that's the sound of the beach movement. You just listen to the Surfaris, and you can just imagine people on the beach just sitting there watching everyone else surf and just crying out when someone wipes out. I would be remiss without talking about country. During this time, there's really kind of a couple different kinds of country. The traditional country is going to be like the Loretta Lynn, the Conway Twitty type music. This is the older music, the country music. A lot of storytelling, a lot of hearts get broken, a lot of cheating, and a lot of stuff like that. And it's a good country. You have to get used to it. It's kind of funny if you ever watch Family Guy. They throw a lot of Conway Twitty on there. It's kind of like their inside joke. But there was some other country too. Johnny Cash. And I call it crossover country because Johnny Cash defied. I mean, Johnny Cash defies a genre. He is pop. He is country. He's Johnny Cash. You see the album here, Johnny Cash went to Folsom Prison, and his Folsom Prison album is like one of the most important of all time. And some of his songs in there capture movement. And you hear the inmates. I mean, they're just moved by Johnny Cash. If you want to learn more about Johnny Cash, go to Nashville, the Johnny Cash Museum. Incredible. But Johnny Cash had a lot of great songs. He had funny songs. A Boy Named Sue. He had a song called One Piece at a Time where he talks about stealing from an auto plant one piece at a time over like 20 years and then trying to put it together and make a car, and it doesn't work. But Johnny Cash, he's timeless. Later on, of course, he does a song called Hurt later on that it's just deep. Johnny Cash is Johnny Cash. And then you got like outlaw country. So you've got like the traditional country, the Loretta Lynn, the Conway Twitty, and the hee-haw type music. But then you also start getting a couple of country music stars that are out there. They're kind of rebels. And I think of Willie and Waylon. If you look over there, Willie Nelson had an album called Redheaded Stranger, one of the greatest country albums of all time. But Willie Nelson becomes a great country singer, and in the 80s, he's going to do albums and movies and stuff like that. Waylon Jennings, his running mate, Lukenbach, Texas, it's another great sound. And the Outlaws, there are other Western singers that are going to sing with them, and that's the younger country artists. And if you listen to the country music today, the roots of country music today are in that 70s outlaw country music back then. And I don't care who you listen to today, but those guys, that gravel road country of today, owes a lot to both Waylon and Willie. Here are some links if you want to kind of take a look at some of the sounds. Here's some more of them. But I would say to you this, at the very end, let's go back to where we started. What kind of music do you listen to? And I kind of think that music is important because every type of music speaks to people. I mean, later on in life, you could hear a song and it transports you back. You remember things, and you remember people, and you remember times in your life. And music speaks to different generations. And the music of the 60s and 70s speaks especially to people of that generation. But you know what? I think it's going to be ageless. There's a lot of that music that'll always be around because there's something to it. Not only that it influences what we listen to today, but it's unique. It's one of a kind stuff. And it is timeless.